senior freshman in history, Lorna Staines, a senior sophomore in English literature and psychology, Izzy Sweeney, a senior freshman in Jewish and Islamic civilizations and ancient history and archaeology. On the opposition, we have Judy Davis, a senior freshman in history and political science, Anil Ulster, a master in laws, Mark Finn, senior freshman in business, economics and social studies, and Rory O'Sullivan, senior freshman in English literature and Greek. So to begin the debate, I will now call on Daniel Clifford to open up the case for the proposition.
Hi, can everyone hear me? All okay? Good. Yeah, very important. It's not a slight change. This House believes that terrorism can be rational is really, really different from this House believes that terrorism can be justified. It's a small point, but I'll return to it. But looking at the title for tonight, asking can terrorism be rational is almost like asking can politics be good. For one, terrorism is an act that humans undertake. And secondly, what type of terrorism are we discussing, what groups are we referring to, and what is terrorism at its core? Common perception is that terrorism is Islamic extremism, but really that's just what we are understanding at the moment. If you go back 60 years in just New York City alone, you had terrorist organizations like the KKK, obviously Islamic terrorism, the Earth Liberation Front, Chilean military groups, and Puerto Rican military groups. So these are different terrorist organizations, these are different types of people, they have different methods of violence and intimidation, and also different rationales for why they do what they do. As a working definition, I'm going to say that terrorism is the indiscriminate or discriminate use of violence or severe intimidation against civilians to achieve a political or religious end. Importantly, notice I didn't say it was always when they do it to us. I do believe that sometimes the West can engage in forms of terrorism as well. But the approach to analysing terrorism usually falls in incomplete categories. Overly generalised assumptions about the social and inner mind of individual terrorists are extrapolated to say something about every form of terrorism. So, good luck to anyone on the opposite side of this debate who wants to make a sort of pop psychology jab at all terrorism. Western terrorism in the 30s and 40s is extremely different from the African Islamic terrorist organization Boko Haram, to the point where you can't compare them. You have to deal with them in their specifics. But this debate also is not about whether terrorism is justified. It isn't a question of when terrorists have a right to do what they do, and it isn't actually a question of whether terrorists are morally superior to us. Again, we keep thinking of terrorism as the idea that only these other people do it to us. It's not true. Simply put, this is about whether terrorism can be seen as a rational method of achieving a goal. When a historian analyzes whether or not a dictator or a warlord acted rationally in their approach, they ask questions about what the goals of that person were and how that person acted to achieve those goals. So saying why someone did something is totally different to saying that they should or should not have done that thing. For example, just to clear this up very, very clearly now, let's pretend that your friend wants to go to the moon. He believes that he's owed money there, right? That's his goal. It's fundamentally irrational, unrealistic, and bizarre. And his aim, what he's going to do, his method, is standing outside with an umbrella, hoping that a strong wind will bring him there. Notice how we all agree here. Is there anyone who disagrees that that is a totally irrational thing to do and thing to believe in? You don't have to talk about whether it was moral. You don't have to talk about whether he's justified in believing it. You know from the facts that what he's trying to achieve is unrealistic, and the way he's going about it is completely unrealistic. So, when you accept that terrorism is rational, all you have to accept is that terrorism works. It helps achieve goals that are themselves realistic, understandable, maybe not morally agreeable. A prime example for me about successful terrorism, and this is extreme terrorism, this is beheading of innocent people, this is murdering large swaths of people based on their religious belief or ethnic belief. It was actually the French Revolution, called literally the Reign of Terror, based on goals that we understand and we can rationalize, liberty, sovereignty, and so on and so forth. We understand that the revolution, to achieve those goals, acted in forms of committed acts of terrorism. You don't have to agree that that's what they should have done, but it worked. It is a tool, and we have to be realistic when we look at the geopolitical landscape. Political terrorism sometimes works, and it's unfortunate to say, but it does. So if terrorism works, and their goals are easily achievable, then they're rational, but they might not be morally justified. There's a difference. I'll take a point of order. I thought that'd be a little bit more controversial, but But look, if the French Revolution is a little bit too far from your mind, let me give you another example. Nelson Mandela is heralded as a driving force for ending apartheid in South Africa. We know this and we accept this, and I don't think very many people would think that he was a moral monster. But Reagan had the ANC, the African National Congress, placed on a terrorist list that he was only removed from in 2008. That was because the KM, the militarized wing of the ANC, blew up government buildings and killed civilians, right? Now, is wanting to end apartheid a completely irrational thought for someone like Nelson Mandela or people in the KM or the ANC? I'll finish this and then I'll take it. No. Was the method of terrorism and democratic talks completely irrational? No. Did it work? Yes. So pragmatically, it was successful. He was a rational person who used a very crude method coupled with democratic processes to gain what he wanted. Now, I'll take the point of information.
It's just to clarify things, so you don't think then that ISIL or Al-Qaeda or the IRA are rational?
Huh?
Just the French Revolution and the ANC?
Well, I was going to keep going, but... Now, this is actually very good. So if all terrorism is fundamentally irrational, how do terrorist groups enter into ceasefires and peace talks? People like the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and the African National Congress. Why do terrorist groups renounce violence on the basis of political goals and talks? Why do they target specific things if they are without good reason or logical rationale? The reason political terrorism exists is precisely because it is rational, it is a pragmatic tool, and unfortunately, it works. Now, there are examples of irrational terrorism too. That is terrorism that didn't achieve the goals of the organization. Black September, for example, is a good example. 1972, Black September kidnapped, I think it was 11 or 12 Olympians, Israeli Olympians, under the guise of trying to get the Israeli soldiers to leave the West Bank and release something like between 250 and 350 hostages. You know that the aims of Black September were completely irrational by the method they used. They weren't going to get it. So the PLO, which was also considered a terrorist organization, Black September and Hamas all operate under a broad spectrum of Palestinian self-determination. But they used methods that didn't help progress their goals. So that's why the PLO, when they agreed to peace talks, were actually more rational than, say, a form of terrorism like Black September. But my main goal tonight is trying to get you to think of terrorism in its specifics. I tried to compare different groups to one another only to demonstrate the rational complexity that we see in terrorism. Now, it is beneficial to my opponents, and I just don't think it's their fault for this, but it is beneficial to construe terrorism as irrational, violent belligerency without any real goals. Because, like my friend over there demonstrated, I mentioned the ANC, he brings up ISIS. Because he's attempting to drive home the idea that all terrorism exists on one plane, but it just doesn't. We have domestic terrorism, we have state-sponsored terrorism, we have state-sanctioned terrorism, and we have political terrorism. So the reason why the French Revolution and the ANC are different from, say, Black September, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, or ISIS is precisely because they're fundamentally different, with different rationales and different goals. I'll take another POI if you want to bring the point back, or I'll take a POI from anyone in the audience. Yeah.
If you have a group like the ANC that you give an example of a rational terrorist organization, does that mean that you're calling Nelson Mandela a terrorist?
Yeah, theoretically, yeah, you would. You would be saying that he engaged in acts of terrorism. So if he did, then yeah, he would be. But the difference is, we're so laden with the idea of moral justification that, oh my God, I just called Nelson Mandela and the ANC a terrorist organization. This is about whether they were rational, not justified. Sometimes terrorism can be seen as justified, but that's not the debate tonight. I'm only trying to drive home the fact that these people act reasonably. Reasonably in the sense that they are achieving goals that are pragmatic. They can achieve those goals using terrorism, because terrorism is a very, very good tool for achieving them. It may not be justified, but let me ask you a question. Why does the United States use terrorism?
Honorary Patron?
Yeah.
How are race relations in South Africa at the moment?
Higher race, well, they don't have apartheid, so I think they're significantly better than they were at the time. I think. Anyways, look, going back to my point, it is beneficial to label all terrorism as a form of violent belligerency without rationale, to attempt to say that it never works, or we can live on these highfalutin concepts that, the real way to get what you want is peace talks, but it's just not true, unfortunately. Now, by calling Mandela's goals and methods irrational forms of terrorism, there's an attempt to stop asking questions, to view all terrorism as one crazy unified aspect of desperate people. But we know this isn't the case. By saying terrorism can never be rational, you immediately deny the ability of yourself to look at the specific set of goals that those individuals want to achieve, whether they were justified morally or not. You may think terrorism can never be morally justified, and I might agree with you, but by saying terrorism can never be rational, you're either saying that terrorism can never achieve its actual political goals, or you're saying that their goals themselves are irrational. Now, do you really want to say that the goals of achieving a non-apartheid state are irrational? I don't think so. So I want us to look to opt to demonstrate the irrationality of using a very successful tool to achieve a very specific set of goals. So please, look to my opponents for reasons why specific political terrorism can never be rational, not simply never be moral. Thank you so much.
We'd like to thank the speaker for his comments, and now we'd like to call on Judy Davis to open up the case for the opposition.
Okay, so the first speaker's argument was that because terrorism always works, it is therefore rational. Now, this is the reason why I asked about South Africa, because the problem often the prop has is that they'll focus on the immediate outcomes of, say, terrorism and not actually look at the longer question. See why apartheid might have disappeared in South Africa immediately after the terrorism. Race relations at the moment in South Africa are terrible. White people still hold most of the power, and there are commonly fights, there are commonly brawls, by no means are respectable. It's also why he mentioned a French Revolution. I'm just going to tackle that real quickly. See, while the French Revolution might have been, at the immediate, been a success in the sense the monarchy was disappeared, the absolute terror and chaos caused by the terrorism had France in this complete standstill, to the point where there were millions of innocent deaths, to the point where Napoleon Bonaparte had to step in to establish a dictatorship, which then led afterwards to another reinstallment of the French monarchy. So to say that the attempts of the terrorists, while immediately they got rid of the monarchy, they were only to very quickly put them back in. So if his argument is that it is rational because it is successful, I'm going to tell you why it's just not successful. Okay, so first of all, my first point. Terrorism is irrational because it harms any attempts at any good. So in order to make the optimum terror attempt, the one that works the most, it needs to be in a public place. It's no good having an attack in a small newsagents. The more people, the better. The maximum terror, the better outcome. That's why Al-Qaeda hit Twin Towers. It's why the IRA plant bombs in places like restaurants, in places like shopping centres. The louder, the better. You need people to hear your message. Okay? The thing is, at the point in which you drive home enough fear to get your message through, you have completely hyperinflated public anxiety. The attacks in Paris by ISIS completely shut the country down. Frightened, people are out of their mind, terrifying, okay? When you've achieved this much level of fear, it is really hard for you to for people to value the message that you're trying to say, because some terrorist groups, it is true, do mean well. They try to help the oppressed, but the problem is, at the point at which you've terrified the public to such an extent, it is very hard for them to understand the good goals that you were trying to attempt or the support, and that's a problem. You see, if you can't get the public on board because they are so frightened by the terrorism that you have committed, it is very hard for them to hear the message you're trying to say. And you need those people. You need those people to stand by. You need them to understand the struggles. You need the Palestinians to stand by Hamas when they try to say that the Palestinian people are being unfairly treated. At the point at which you frighten them, it's very difficult for them to do so. This means that any political change that you hope to achieve, like the freedom of the Palestinians, is completely delegitimized, and you lose any shot of doing any good or trying to help people. Therefore, if you want to change things, as many terrorists do, and some that are trying to do well, if you want to do good, by taking in this form of terrorism, you ensure that you never meet those goals. You ensure that terrorism never works, because you frighten people too much, they will no longer listen to your views. And therefore, it is irrational, because you've only further hurt yourself. This is why, this is why in Northern Ireland, basically, it was incredibly difficult for like them to implement any peace because people wouldn't cooperate, because people wouldn't listen, because at the point where your family have been killed by the IRA, you're unwilling to listen to anything they said. That's why, like, even after there were like peace treaties brought in, like Northern Ireland is so shaky because people still remember what happened. This also ensures that you never get any support from other countries. It means that like no other country will stand by you, no other country will help like embargoes, no other country will help force the government to listen to you, because at the point where you have killed people, because that's often what happens to terrorists, the point where you've like frightened and terrorized people, they are unlikely to come to your aid. It's why, for example, like the EU, it's very difficult for them to do anything in Palestine because Hamas kills innocent Israelis. It is very difficult for you to get international support, which you need to like help further your goal. It is incredibly difficult for you to do so when you use this means. So because like terrorism doesn't work, because it frightens people to the point where they no longer will listen to you, which means that your views are completely delegitimized. It means that you are further away from the goal from when you started. It means that like because like this act hurts you, it's completely irrational for you to take part in terrorism. Like it is because you are only hurting yourself. It is also completely irrational because the costs are too high to ever rationalize a decision. So we say a rational decision, a rational choice, is the best choice when you weigh up the cost or benefits. It's the one that, like, when you look at all the others, it is the optimum one to get what you want. So in order for the prop to win this debate tonight, they have to prove to us that terrorism is the best because it is you get the most benefits for the minimum costs compared to others. So because the benefits are non-existent, because you are unable to get international support, because you've completely like frightened people, because you have killed people, which often happens, because you have like threatened and forced a state, it is very difficult to get international support because you like make it very hard for people to cooperate with you on the other side when you have frightened and terrorized them. Because basically there are no benefits to it because it never works. The costs are also incredibly enormous. Because when terrorism fails, as it often does in many states, there is always a vicious backlash. Like the government always cracks down really hard because they try to maintain some form of peace. They try to maintain like anything. So like they will crack down incredibly hard on this group that they feel are violent because now they have the justification to do so. It happened in Northern Ireland. They were completely justified in cracking down on the Catholics because the IRA showed them that they were a threat to society. And like this isn't just a game. Like if the costs are incredibly dangerous. Like at best, when you fail at terrorism, the worst you do is like the state will only violently suppress you much more. But at worst, you risk like you and your loved ones being rounded up, being killed. Not only that, but you also damage like future generations and like their attempts. So at the point where like the IRA ruined the name of like freedom because of their terrible actions, it makes it incredibly difficult for any more future generations of Catholics to stand forward because they've basically painted them up with the same brush. Therefore, because you have like not only hurt the ones you love, the ones you fight for, and the future generations that like come from you, there basically are an enormously immense costs. So because there are like no benefits, because it doesn't work, because you like dissuade everyone from supporting you and you need that support, because the costs are incredibly like high, it is incredibly irrational for you then to take this because it isn't the optimum choice. It isn't the best choice. So for those reasons, because it is like not the optimum choice, because it only hurts you, it is incredibly irrational for you to take part in this. And for those reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
I think I'll keep him there.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Louis Hoffman. Today I'll be strongly proposing the motion that this House believes that terrorism be rational. Before I continue on with my argument, I'd like to refute a bit of what the lovely lady said. She talked about the costs and benefits of terrorism, said how there was put little on how they were not rational. She also talked about how that if you terrorised a population, you could never gain any respect off them. I'd like to refute that Hezbollah in Lebanon is actually seen as has more right to rule than the government, according to the majority of the Lebanese people. But okay, so now we continue on to my argument. Before I can begin the task of proving the rationale behind terrorism, the vague language with which this question is asked provides the debate with the first major hurdle. As the ancient Greek sophist Thermachus said, man is the measure of all things, meaning that morality and things like rationale are completely and utterly subjective and open to interpretation. What can be entirely rational to you is abhorrently irrational to me. So, for the sake of this debate, we are to assume that the rationale we are to compare terrorism to is the vague and broad concept of Western principles. People somehow seem to believe that this would make mine and the proposition's task immeasurably more difficult, but quite the contrary, it makes it far easier. So much of the logic and thought behind modern-day terrorism can be found deeply embedded in the Western mindset, which is riddled with hypocrisies and falsehoods. Even the term terrorism is one that is so laden with negative connotations that it automatically skews one's perception of the associated group or person. This word is once again a subjective word used as a method of political suppression. Who decides who is labelled a terrorist or a terror threat? Only the very people who want to keep said group and their message down, the modern-day nation-state. The branding of a group or terrorist is a political move used to delegitimise and open up an organisation for an attack and harsh reprisals. A great phrase is written across the walls of the Imperial War Museum in London: one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. The perfect example of this are the Kurdish PKK, who were labelled a terrorist group by NATO, yet Turkish counterinsurgencies in the early 80s and 90s left up to 35,000 civilian dead. Where then is the rationale behind this, and who is the real terrorist when it is the nation state who kills more than the terrorists themselves? Indeed, it is unlikely that this alien example has done much to convince you of the rationale of terrorism, but when we look closer to home, it gets considerably more uncomfortable for those perched upon their moral high horse. Terrorist organisations, more often than not, fight for what we consider to be rational and a fundamental right of any citizen on this world, the right to self-determination. To the Irish, this is one of the very cornerstones of our very nation. The early IRA used violence and guerrilla warfare tactics to ensure that the children of this island could be governed by the citizens of this island. The violence was entirely necessary to ensure that an Irish could be brought about, and it was through the barrel of the gun that our independence was gained. This, though, is where it gets interesting, where the complexities of the lies we tell ourselves begin to unravel. We tell ourselves that, no, this is different. This is most definitely different. The IRA, they fought a war of independence, and noble and right, and of course it was right to want a nation free from British rule. But not like I'm all right. But then when we compare it to the Tamil Tigers or the Kurds, who fight for similar causes, we quickly label them as terrorists and irrational lunatics. Yet if one was to question the rationale behind the creation of the Irish state, you'll either be labelled a Westbrit or, in my case, a posh, stuck-up wanker. On top of this, we would recall in horror if anyone was to attempt to compare Padraig Pearse to Abu al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. For those who don't know, though I must concede there are many differences, many core principles remain similar between the two. Even in Northern Ireland, the later IRA used violence to bring about a relatively peaceful solution in a very dangerous and volatile region. It is important to remember that through violence, a political statement, a message of intent, and socio-political change can be brought about. Arguably, it is not the cleanest cut way to do so, but in some cases, violence is needed to create the social upheaval needed to ensure a better tomorrow. As aforementioned, no one would dare to question that the French Revolution was not both bloody and brutal, but that the change and the onset of modern democracy as we know it means that the lives that were lost were repaid 10 times over. If progress, human advancement, and the attacking of tyranny is irrational, then I'm not sure I want to exist in this world anymore. Of course, when we discuss modern-day terrorism, it is impossible to ignore suicide bombing. To most of us, this seems the most irrational acts of all of these organisations, this mainly being due to a break with our obsession with both the individual and self-preservation. The concept of a common good or a cause worth dying for have largely been forgotten about by the Westerners as we become obsessed with the fickleness of our daily life. Robert Pape, in an extensive piece of work on the topic, discusses the logic and rationale of suicide attacks. He points out that they are not carried out willy-nilly or at random, but in fact, in the cases of Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah and Hamas, follow strict rules and are always used to achieve set strategic gains that must outweigh potential loss. If that's not rational, again, I don't know what is. As has been released in several open letters and manuals by both organisations, the suicide bombing is in essence carried out for 3 reasons. 1, it is to use coercive power upon democracies to force them to remove troops and influence from areas of contention. 2, it is to make up for conventional inferiority in terms of weaponry. One man with no training can do more damage than several well-trained men and strike fear into the hearts of their enemy. 3, we are weak and care more about the individual than the collective, and this threat scares us. Terrorism is entirely strategic and a rational plan that is based in both military thought and thinking. It is no different from what we Western powers do when attempting to take out insurgencies or enemies of the state. We plan according to our strengths and the weaknesses of our enemies. We fight to kill, we fight to win. The media and government say terrorism is mindless because they want us to think that. They want us to think that any terrorist must be idiotic, deluded, or mentally unhinged to do such things, that no rational, logical person could ever commit such acts, while at the same time we perpetrate the exact same crimes, but come up with lovely little phrases like collateral damage and establish rules of war that suit the status quo. Indeed, the main reason we use terms such as rational logic, barbarism when discussing things like this is because we are weak, scared, and afraid. We believe ourselves above violence and see it as some form of failure of the human condition, something that with enough progressive safe spaces we can gradually phase out of our society. But all lies. Terrorism is wholly rational. We try and say it is not because it is dedicated to the destruction of everything we stand for, whether right or wrong. It is based in irrefutable logic that we base our very lives around. The moral qualms with terrorism are nothing more than a sign of a failure of the European people, the sign of our decadence and the sign of the collapse of one of the greatest peoples in the world. The only gauge we should judge terrorism on is success, of which it is most definitely a success. Thank you for your time.
We'd like to thank the speaker for his comments, and now I'd like to call on Anil Oster to continue the case of the opposition. Anil, as this is your first time speaking in the chamber, you're afforded the same names rights. Would you like to keep these rights, or would you?
I will keep them. And I would like to thank you for the member of opposing team for highly emotional speech and conspiracy theories. As my name suggests, I am from Turkey, and being an ordinary citizen of Turkey, which is victim of terrorist attacks, gives me first-hand experience on terrorism. And due to that, I also had a chance to observe the international community's interpretation on terrorism and their response to that. And based on these observations, I decided to run for the opposing team. And I will not start with an academic definition of terrorism. As honorable member of the opposing team has said, terrorism is a method to reach a goal. But I think that method can be used of course, but is not useful to achieve a goal, whatever that goal might be. Firstly, terrorism causes fear and anger in all layers of society. Unlike the unconventional war or unlike the civil resistance movements this country and my country had fought against their oppressors, namely Ottoman Empire or British Empire, they don't have all of the society behind them. They represent only a minority view, and whatever the goal of us or aspiration of the organization might be, it creates anger and distress for all members of that society. Those who are sympathetic, members of that minority, fear from stigmatization and persecution. And the broader society fears death, basically, instant death. And if they are not dead in the first terrorist attack they encountered, they fear at least from the change of the world known to them. Yeah, I know we all have aspirations for change within a society, in a country, or globally. But I think regardless of the fervor or speed, at which we would wish to see that change instituted. When terrorism is picked as a method, that change is not the wished change. I personally witnessed a terrorist attack. I was at a peace rally when 2 ISIS suicide bombers exploded themselves, and I witnessed how terrorism works. I witnessed the carnage, destruction, distress. I saw body parts thrown in front of me, people dying. And as a result of this, I didn't see ISIS becoming more successful. I only see my government becoming a more oppressive one and my country becoming a darker place. And this attack, there are 3 subsequent attacks after that. These attacks combined not only affected who witnessed or who were present at that situation, but they affected all of the society and leave Turkey, as you might have all known, as a whole, a less confident, less assured of itself country. And I don't think terrorist organizations might have international support for a long time. As honorable member of the opposition team has said, Kurdish separatist organization in my country, PKK, had support from many European capitals. And they were striking, of course, not only military, but also innocent civilian targets. In my country, and I think after the recent explosions in Brussels, European societies are still as eager to support any terrorist organization, be it Hamas or PKK. Yeah, as they say, the indiscriminate killing of innocent, unarmed men, women and children are hard to defend. And I'm not discussing that, but as a method, targeting those who have no direct control over the situation, whatever the goal might be, I don't think this is a rationalistic thing to do. Be it your goal, free Irish state, free Kurdish state, free Palestine, how noble or, I don't know, ignoble it might be, like ISIS's goals, you cannot achieve it by targeting people who have no direct control over that. And in conclusion, while terrorists seek to institute change, that change, I think, cannot be brought about by, as I said, killing innocent people, restricting their freedom, or suspending at least their basic rights. Even if the terrorists succeed, as we see in Palestine, I'm sorry, I know this country is Palestine, but even if they succeed to overthrow the oppressors, we see that they become as swiftly the new oppressors as well. It is how can I say, just a bad method. It has no rationale. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
We'd like to thank the speaker for his very personal speech, and we'd now like to call on Lorna Staines to continue the case before the proposition.
I think it's important to give a point of framing before I continue in this speech. I am not here today to say that I like the groups who get to use terrorism, and many of the groups I have massive issues with. And I'm not here today to say that I think terrorism is something that is does a good, is a horror in our lives, and we've received an important speech on that just there. What I am here to say, though, is that when we treat the people who do terrorism, we treat the groups who do terrorism as irrational and other, I think you dismiss them and you stop treating them as people who are interacting with. It is important to understand that even if a horror occurs with it, there can be a rationale to why you do it, to why this ends up happening, and when you don't engage with that, when you treat it as irrational, you mitigate those people and you perpetuate the necessity of horrors like that. I think you can see this probably most clearly when you look at, say, the speeches we've seen on off. They tell you that you should aim for peace, that you should always, like, the goal is peace. Recognize the people who do this aren't simply like, they think one day maybe this is the easy way. Potentially, if you're an omnipotent deity, an omnipotent deity with power, then maybe, yes, waiting for peace and treaty is the way to do it. But recognize the people who are in this situation, they perceive themselves as already being attacked, already at war, or they are retaliating against a larger system. They're not just stepping out and like thinking, oh well, that talking thing wasn't great, let's try something else. It's important to understand people don't function as omnipresent like creatures who understand exactly how possibly things could go, particularly in situations when you are powerless. It's incredibly difficult to perceive why a country like that might help you. So who are these people? I'm first going to start by talking with you guys. Understand your culture and your person are not separate things. They're inextricably linked to who you are. That how you speak, how you think, how you expect the world to exist, your mannerisms, your sense of humor, everything that builds around you is also built from the culture in which you've grown up in, the culture you've lived in. If you notice the fact that I can use the terms grand, crack, and gas without any of you being confused what they mean, despite not meaning the word they mean at all. That is because we have a culture and a language built into that culture. That does impact how you do exist in the world. That impacts how you see the world and how it exists. No, we also have this perpetual dislike of Britain, even though none of us have existed in a time period where Britain was nothing but a prosperous benefit to us. Brexit's about to change that, but before now, we were pretty good with them. That is why it can often be so easy for us to see a different group behaving in a way, say, who is against our perception of what the right world is, like our West democratic world, as something as other or alien or clearly confused about what is happening. It's so easy often to forget your culture is incredibly important to who you are and how you see the world, and that is also true for the rest of the world who perceive different cultures and different histories in that culture. Note again is incredibly important. That combined with when you perceive your identity and your culture as being under threat, and that can happen instead. When you see perceived and real threats to your country, note there are lots of reasons why Iraq and Afghanistan and Iran could be incredibly mad at the West. We have objectively done things that have destabilized them, caused them massive harms for the gains of the West rather than ourselves. See any Cold War era country ever. Note this also happens within your own countries. It can often feel perceived and real hatred and stigmatization towards particularly your culture, even within a broader community. See your own country rejecting you and attacking you, or see another country rejecting you and attacking you. Examples like France or a lot of Eastern European countries and Europe in general right now. These things can feel consolidate to feeling like you and your identity are being attacked. You and your culture, you and your religion, whatever you want to label it, whatever group you fall into. That is a rational feeling that can occur when real and perceived things occur to happen to you. No. It is important to understand these impacts have real meaning to people in their lives. That we are not just separate creatures with no comprehension, that we can sit back and go, well, maybe the West will help us if we negotiate with them. It can feel like a very personal attack. When you ignore this, when you fail to see that these people might have rational reasons to see history in a distinctly different way to you do, when they see that you bringing democracy to them or whatever you like to call it can actually feel like an attack, when you don't engage with that, when you dismiss it as irrational or never a reason you might make that decision, then you ignore those people, you place them as other. Okay, now, who are these people? Note, in that culture, this can develop, this fear. In this fear where you feel this larger entity attacking you, this group you can't engage with on the democratic ways you want to talk about, either because that country is too much bigger than you, or because in that society you were too isolated and too alienated to be ever gain that real democratic way you want to say. Terrorism can be a rational way for you to perceive an ability to respond to that. So you can't attack in other ways because it's not an equal playing field. That is an important thing, because that is an important thing. So presumably the silver bullet that I always like to pull out in this is but civilians. Recognize that is a group, that is just a justification why specifically terrorism is bad, but ignoring the fact that all warfare is like that. Understand that in any war you can name in the history of your life, including drawing warfares, the biggest casualties are civilians. Any warfare has always caused the most death and the most destruction to civilians. For example, even things in World War II, the Dresden bombing was an insignificant attack that only targeted civilians. That is the definite, just to terrorize the German people. That was terrorism within it, but we allow that within the frame of warfare.
Why do we do that? Because the countries that are in power, the large countries, are also the countries that can dictate what we consider acceptable warfare and what we mark as terrorism, what we mark as other and people attacking them. That is that is an arbitrary basis for it, and there's no point eluding it. Terrorists offer a capacity for big countries, for people who have no power, for groups who have no ability to actually engage with these people, to bring their views to the forefront, to keep a presence. Like Julie says, that we should wait for people, like we reduce sympathy. Lots of these groups see that they're already under attack and nobody cares or nobody notices. How much would you honestly know about the difficulties in Iraq or Afghanistan if they didn't perpetually keep it in your foreground? It's like, this is an issue. This is an issue that's happening to us that we perceive as harming. It's not pleasant, but it's something we feel, it's something that is a rational way to engage with warfare when you are too small to do it in other means. It's also a way, like at the end of this, we say even in situations which are have an unclear narrative, like say bombing within your own country, bombing in Iraq, which does happen, we say that there is a rational steps towards why you might decide that is, they are a group who are attacking you, or this is an ideology that is attacking you. We say, I don't have to agree with when they do that, but I do have to say that when you mitigate it, when you treat it as something like just evil or other, it's something that you could never do, when you don't engage with those people, you don't engage with what's happening in their lives to why they might reach there, you see that person as a group as less or other and you perpetuate you perpetuate a cycle of us and them. You perpetuate the idea that you can't engage with these other people. At the end of the day, at the end of that result, that continues a narrative where we cannot empathise to them. It's important to propose.
I would like to thank the speaker for her comments, and now I would like to call on Mark Finn to do the case of the opposition.
People leaving before you start, always a good sign. I want us to take a step back. I want us to detach ourselves from the lens with which we look at terrorism, which is from the lens of a political science student, from the lens of what our lecturer tells us about, like not within a chamber where we're sitting around very comfortably. Because when we are talking about something, it's often to forget that there are humans involved. It's often easy to forget that this is something that concerns real people. Because when we look, if we're someone who experiences terrorism, who experiences the loss of a family member, who experiences the actual violent effects that affect real people, the grief, the destruction, the despair, what we get an insight, that is when we see this violence at its worst. We get an insight onto this. We share, Je suis Charlie, we change our Facebook profile pictures to flags. We seem to say some level of remorse. And it's at that time that none of us would ever dare share a leftist Guardian article about the facts that we care about, Western intervention in the Middle East, or that we should do it in a particular way, because we see the pure evil of it. We see at that point how much destruction this causes. We cannot say that that level of destruction is something that's rational. 3 things in this speech. Members of the University Philosophical Society, ladies and gentlemen, rationality. We've been told that terrorism is the method to achieve a goal. We're going to take that definition. We say that's fair. So we say 2 things that need to stand there for them to win. Either that, firstly, we have to say that goal has to be rational. Personally, I've yet to find rationale for describing why a state should exist where there's an argument in favour of throwing someone off a building because they happen to be gay. If anyone can give me that argument, I would be delighted to hear it. But even if we... Okay. Sure, yeah.
We didn't bring that up precisely because we're not talking about that. We're talking about different forms of political terrorism. You can't say we said that.
Okay, so your burden is to defend terrorism in its entirety. It can't be picking and choosing the nice bits of terrorism. Okay, so we say that even we'll take though, you're the burden you've set yourself, where it's this terrorism that does have just goals, and we're happy to stand by certain times groups use terrorism to have just goals. But we say that there are lots of things that are justifiable in this world, but we simply have boundaries in terms of what we do with them and to what extent we're willing to achieve them. We say that the ends do not always justify the means. The idea of everyone having a kidney on a waiting list is a good thing. The idea of the state coming around and forcibly removing kidneys from people who have 2 healthy ones is not a good idea. Anyone who went to get a locker this morning knows that getting up there is generally a good thing. However, bribing a security guard so you get there early might be taking it a bit too far. It might be doing too much to achieve a particular goal, even if that goal might be rational. we're going to talk now about like what this violence is. We say that there are certain things that we just simply do not believe are to be good. We say that this level of violence, the level of violence that's committed by terrorism, is not something we ever believe can be justified. We think it's different when we're talking about war. Why? Firstly, the targets that are involved. When in war, Lorna is right that civilians do die. The difference is civilians are not the main target. They are often seen as collateral. They are often seen as something that to be like minimized. No thanks, Chris. To be minimized. Okay? We say that when you with terrorism, your main target is someone who is not like an actor in the war, who's not a soldier who consented in, who knows the risks, whose family knows the risks, is an innocent civilian who doesn't know that risk, whose family have never considered that they may lose that person because they never opted into a war like this. These people who don't have a stake in the game. Okay? That is the first difference. Second difference is that we set rules with regards to war. No thanks. Okay, we have things, for example, like a Geneva Convention. We have the fact that when people were brought to the gallows, they used to be allowed to have a drink in the pub first. We have ways and etiquette of doing things. We have proportional responses. We have, even though there's massive amounts of public pressure to be more tough in the Middle East, US politicians will not do that because they realize that there are just certain things that we shouldn't do. We don't, by the way, on that note, stand over every single action the West has taken. We don't necessarily say that some of those actions are irrational, or some of those actions are rational. But the difference with terrorism is that there is no rule. There is no rule, there is nothing that is too far, there's nothing that is too extreme. We say it's fundamentally selfish. To say that your ideology is so important that you would actually like kill innocents for it. To say that we take it to that extent, that your goal is so important to you that you would do and cause this much destruction, we say that's a bad thing. We say that this violence is just awful. That is when these children who are going home to having no parents, that is parents who have to bury the remains of their children, that people's lives are destroyed, this level of grief. And we say this level of grief, we cannot say this is something that is rational. We cannot say that this is something we deem to be just. We cannot say that this is something that we think that this goal or the methods of achieving this goal is a rational way of doing it. We say as well that we are human beings, that remorse is something that is important to us. We feel empathy when we see something we don't like. We feel that when there's something wrong, we feel angry, we demonstrate, we share a leftist Guardian article about it, we grieve, we feel upset, we do something to help others because we're not totally selfish beings. The difference is that when you're giving someone the choice to jump off the wreckage of the burning Twin Towers on September 11 or to stay there to be burnt to death, you're doing that without remorse. You don't care. That is what is irrational. Human beings do care about this. This is something that is different. We say it is different to political violence. We've heard the example of guerrilla warfare from this side. That is different in terms of it was targeted against people. It is something that is not simply about innocence. It involves things like riots. And also just, if we look through history, other methods do work. It's just categorically untrue for this side to say that it always has to be terrorism. That is the only way of achieving these. Note when Lorna tells you that it is the last minute, that's simply not the case. Firstly, lots of people don't opt into this terrorism. Lots of people do live under the oppression of the West and the Middle East and don't feel that this is the only way to achieve this thing. Or they just simply feel that even though that goal is a good one, that there are certain things we should not do for a goal because those things are simply too horrible. We say as well, this is something we see more in the modern world. We get better and better at peace. We are more averse to violence. We care more about other people. We care more about solving these peacefully. But even if none of that were true, even if we see violence justified, we just simply say that terrorism is something that just doesn't work. What terrorism is, like studies have just conclusively shown that terrorism prolongs wars. Why is this why won't this be true? We say you get responses from Western states. You feel there's public pressure to reply that leads to escalation of violence. Note that when you're going up against, say, the might of the United States military, you tend not to fare as well. We see that with the fact that the size of the caliphate of the Islamic State is shrinking. We see that with what has currently happened in Libya. Okay? We say that you get solidarity of opposition against you. You have people who are less likely to be sympathetic towards your cause because your cause is now not something we can do in this world of rules. It's not something we can talk about because you have said that you're below that level of talking. We say that means that if your methods of achieving things don't work. We see this in terms of the fact that violence hurt the suffragette movement. Perception of violence was used as a method against them. It meant that women were seen as hysterical. That was something that was used against. It never worked as an effective method. We see that in the fact that if your goal is to prevent people sharing a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad, then the attack on Charlie Hebdo was the one way to ensure that lots of people shared that cartoon, lots of people drew that cartoon, and lots of people felt that solidarity. We say to you that with this level of violence, that it is something that we can just never deem to be rational. That while the goal may be, and we're not even sure it is all the time, that there are certain things we just shouldn't do to commit a goal because the horror of them is simply too much. Beg you to oppose.
for my childminders one day when I was about 5 and a half. She had this panic-stricken look on her face, and herself and my minder were talking in hushed tones about how awful it was. And I remember her then that night pacing backwards and forwards in front of the TV. She was on the phone to relatives, trying to make sure that everyone was okay. And that was the first time that I knew what it was to commit an act of terror. I had this feeling of overwhelming sadness and that there was no escaping the evil that exists in this world. And I couldn't understand what was going on. I had the same feeling when I logged onto my Facebook earlier this summer and saw that picture of that young boy covered in ash and blood who was caught in that airstrike in Syria. Terrorism in all of its forms is devastating and unforgivable. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not rational. And now, unlike when I was 5, I can understand that and appreciate the leveled nuances to it. I think everyone in this room can agree on the fact that the tragedies that have occurred across the world at the hands of people are deeply saddening and the acts themselves are indefensible. But when we claim that terrorism is irrational, we don't necessarily move anywhere forward in order to try stop it, or moreover, in understanding the reasoning behind those tragedies. Unlike most of this debate, I won't necessarily be playing tit for tat with examples of terrorism and whether it's right or wrong. And I think Mark is right when he says let's take a step back, but we should look back and look at the reasoning behind this. I won't pick the nice parts either, but I won't necessarily defend them either. I don't think we can defend IS because I think what they're doing is a genocide. I don't think genocide is ever defensible, and the example that Mark gives is also, in my eyes, a form of genocide, right? So if we are claiming that terrorist groups are irrational, then we believe that their means and their methods are not conducive to them achieving the end goal. Terrorism, I'm going to give another definition of terrorism because why not? Terrorism is the unauthorized and unofficial use of violence to achieve political aims. And that seems curious to me because apparently if a state in an authorized sanction bombs a wedding, that's okay because of consent or whatever Mark tried to say. And it's an act of warfare. No, but when a so-called terrorist group does it, it's an act of terror. I think we have to have a conversation as well when we talk about terrorism, about states' roles in modern warfare and indeed modern diplomacy. So states will often act in their best interests, or what they perceive to be their best interests. And that is not or what is most advantageous for their country. And that's not always a rational choice either. So if we take the Iraq War, for example, and the reasoning used to justify that at the time, for example, like there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and it was to give the people diplomacy. That was not a rational invasion. It was not a rational choice to engage in that warfare. If we take what side opposition have said, because presumably in order for something to be rational, the end goal must be worth it, we then must say that the Iraq War was rational. In reality, I think most people would agree that the reasoning behind the Iraq invasion, in reality, was oil, and that the UN never really did find those weapons of mass destruction. And it's unclear to me what the US Army has ever done in terms of giving Iraq diplomacy. If we looked at what actually happened, in the end, turn of public opinion, the deaths of hundreds of thousands of citizens on both sides, creation of all sorts of insurgent groups across the Middle East, and that was not necessarily conducive to what Bush was trying to achieve. And Julie's right when she says we must look further. We must look further than just what the initial reasoning behind that was. Like we must look as well at how the methods were used to achieve these ends. Like no terrorist group necessarily is rational in using these as a method to achieve them, right? For example, like the IRA bombing of the Brighton Hotel in 1984, the bombing of the central locations in Tel Aviv by Hamas. They're right. That doesn't do anything to help Israeli opinion of Palestine. But maybe it's not about achieving that end goal as they've all tried to claim. Terrorist groups aren't just fanatics. Often they are people who are just disillusioned by what is happening to their country or for their cause. It is the oppression felt by these people that leads them to commit acts of terror. It is states not allowing them to express themselves, to give them a diplomatic voice in this matter. Even if they do get that voice, often it is met with uncompromising and unyielding demands on the side of the oppressor or agitator or state in most cases. Terrorism generally doesn't work that well. It's not necessarily a good way to set up a state or gain recognition by a state or whatever it is you're trying to achieve, because obviously you've had to harm some entity, 1 minute Rory, in the process. And like Julie says, like you necessarily don't get the goal that you want. But it is a means of catharsis. Rory, go ahead.
Okay, so conspiracy theories about oil aside, many militaries measure success in war by how few casualties they cause. The IRA and Hamas measure it by how many. Does that difference matter to you at all?
No, not at all, because they're still bombing innocent civilians in Syria, Rory, so it doesn't really matter to me how they measure it. What I'm trying to say is that this is about catharsis for terrorist groups. Generally, terrorist groups are made up of a minority led by some form of hierarchy that allows them for their grievance to be aired and justified in a space that they don't get elsewhere. Committing an act of terror is a way in which the disenfranchised can feel as if they have achieved justice, and you feel you are creating a better world for your cause. So when Julie talks about having a future, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to have a future for their cause. So when the terror attacks happened in France, it didn't make any sense to me or to most people as to why that will achieve anything necessary for IS. But for them, it's justice. It's carrying out of justice in the name of their God. Jihad is a part of Islam. That in itself, in Islam, is debatable but about what it means. But to them, they're fulfilling their duty and spreading the word of God and protecting the word of God. And this to them is rational, because what else are they supposed to do, and how else are they supposed to protect their religion and their religious freedom when this is what they know and believe to be true? When European women flee to IS, it's not that they're not intelligent enough to know that they are committing atrocities. It's just that this is how they feel that they can air their grievance, and this is the best way forward. When Hamas tries to use diplomatic means in achieving Palestinian freedom, and for years they get nowhere, for them terrorism is a means to an end. In the same way that the support for the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq was at peak in 2002 after 9/11, it is because people are seeking justice. And so perhaps it is irrational to assume that terrorism gets you anywhere. But when you've literally got no other means of seeking justice, when the state constantly pushes you down, sometimes not even a state you recognize, sometimes not even your own state, it is rational to seek some kind of justice. It may be reverting back to methods which are illogical and barbaric, but when you've got nothing else to lose, it's hard to think of any other way that you can gain. I beg you to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for her comments, and I'd like to call on Roy O'Sullivan to close the case with the opposition and indeed the debate as well.
In some places, in southern Waziristan in Pakistan, if you play music out loud, you will be shot. The difference between Izzy and myself is just this. She believes that that is something which can be read in the context of Western paradigms and whatever else Foucault wrote. I believe that that is evil. The difference between Izzy and myself is this. She wants to understand what that attacker is doing so that we can appreciate where they're coming from and see that maybe there are other points of view. I believe that we need to understand that sometimes people are evil, that sometimes the things they do are evil, and that until we acknowledge that, and that is true even if the Tory party say it, that they are evil, even if George Bush says they are evil, we will be able to protect the victims of those attacks and the people of southern Waziristan. We got a lot of weirdness in this debate about the word rational. You know, the first speaker, Dr. Philosophy, said, well, you know, anything is rational, and, you know, rational and justified are very different. But he got his Greek mixed up with his Latin, right? Because he means logical whenever he says rational. You know, imagine if I am greatly offended by the colour of Matthew Newding's tie, and consequently I want to kill him. It would be logical. It would be logical, rational, they say, if I buy a weapon and do this. If I have axiom X, which is that I want to pursue Y, and I pursue I follow the best means of achieving X. What I say is that though that may be a logical thing to do, it is irrational because it is batshit insane to want to kill Matthew for that reason. So sometimes something is logical, but the motive makes it irrational. Moreover, how the acts match up is the other thing, by the way. We all probably want to end poverty, right? No one here wants to continue poverty. But if I say, let's end poverty by killing the poor, or indeed by killing the rich, we might say, no, thank you. Yes, that does end poverty, but it probably, in terms of severity, the means of getting it probably just doesn't justify those ends, right? But I'm going to go one step further, right? I think that if it is immoral, it is irrational. I don't know what rational means if it doesn't mean the best outcome for everybody in general. I think that it is always immoral to commit acts of terrorism, and it is always completely and thoroughly immoral to do so. And because of that, it is always irrational. What do I mean by that? Because we got from the prop bench in general, was, a lot of what is terrorism anyway, isn't it a meaningless word, and aren't all words meaningless and determined by the hegemony of the superstructure and the capitalist bourgeoisie, and we should never forget it. But we did get a pretty robust definition of terrorism from the first speaker, which then fell out of the debate, which was roughly that it involved using violence or terror against civilians to achieve political ends, and the deliberate use of that. The first thing I want to note, just as a key thing, because we got a lot of points of information about like the French Revolution and stuff, their facts are wrong, right? It's worth noting that civilians cannot use violence to inspire terror in themselves, as they suggest that they did in France, and moreover, they cannot do so and inspire terror in civilians when they are resisting the government that is themselves committing acts of terror in those civilians to stay on top, as they did in South Africa. I have no idea why they think the French Revolution was a good thing. They seem not to have read at all about the French Revolution, but that's neither here nor there. So we have some idea about what it is. It is that you intend to cause, in a given act, the most harm to the most people. That's really important, because that is the distinction between terrorism and a lot of other things. No, thank you. The distinction between terrorism and a lot of Western violence. Certainly not all Western violence, but it's the reason that we don't just get to say, well, we do it, so why don't they? There's a difference between 9/11 and a civilian casualty in a drone strike. I think that it is intuitive. The difference between, there's a moral difference between trying to cause as few civilian casualties as possible and as many. But moreover, I think that the aims are generally more justified, because conspiracy theories about oil aside, the majority of people in southern Waziristan, in Pakistan, support the drone strikes of the United States. And they do it because the primary aim of those drone strikes is to kill the people who are killing them. And they think that's a wonderful thing, because they're on their way to your house to murder you, and suddenly a bomb from the sky falls and kills them. I think that's generally, no thank you, a good thing. But it doesn't matter, right? The point is that distinction is crucial. But moreover, you have to be trying to inspire fear in that population when you're committing an act of terrorism. And lastly, you have to believe something so profoundly. Well, something that, an ideology that wants you to carry out an act of terror, let's say. And moreover, you have to subscribe to that ideology so profoundly that you're going to do it. Something that makes you think that you need to do this, and something that makes you think that you want to. I think that any ideology that does that is a horrific one. That's why I think that all terrorism is inherently irrational and horrific, and because that kind of idea is a very specific thing. So they're very simple, people that do terrorism for good reasons because they want good things, right? The very simple reason why good things are never why terrorism happens is that if any ideology requires, at a given moment, that you kill as many people as possible, it probably has very little to do with the welfare of those people. So the examples that we got, right? We got the example of the KKK. The KKK probably does not care about the black people that it terrorizes and tortures across the United States. Hamas's charter calls or evokes a religious passage in which there's a genocide against the Jewish people. It probably does not care about the welfare of the people of Israel. But moreover, it's not just things that don't care. It's things where the abstract idea comes before the actual welfare of people. So in Northern Ireland, the idea of a united Ireland comes before anybody in the Europa Hotel, which was bombed like 98 times or something, and their lives and their benefits. The idea of God's laws of Islamic State comes before the welfare of the person playing music in the streets, or whose hand is cut off because they stole something, or who is stoned to death because of adultery. It has nothing to do with the human beings in those ideologies. It is all to do with this abstract idea that they are trying to achieve. I do think that's an irrational thing. I think simultaneously they acknowledge the severity of that terrorism, and simultaneously they mitigate it. I think that it's a severe thing to want something so badly like that, and so divorced from all of the people around you that you're willing to kill them to achieve it. Look, we are afraid, and by the way, we can ask why this happened. why some people do evil things and are convinced by evil ideas. I think that's an interesting and an important question that we need to ask. But sometimes I think we're afraid of saying that people and ideas are evil when we shouldn't be. Because sometimes, even if the people who have power are saying they're evil, even if people we don't like are saying they're evil, they are evil. And the harm that they are doing is killing people, and those are the people that we should be saving. Thank you very much.